All Airbus aircraft are designed and tested to be safe to fly up to design limit speed, which is a value with margin well above VMO/MMO at cruising altitude. There is therefore no need to rush in taking over manually when the aircraft reaches VMO/MMO. The autopilot will remain engaged throughout most of the overspeed events encountered in cruise. The autopilot will only automatically disconnect if there is a large or prolonged VMO/MMO exceedance. Hello and welcome back to Airbus What's It Doing Now, and a very warm welcome to our new subscribers. The subscriber count is going up daily and it's really excellent and warming to see so many people take up the interest in the channel, and that the information is getting out to the network, so really grateful for that. And a special thank you to those that have supported the channel, really much appreciated. If you're able to and you'd like to, you can do so at buymeacoffee.com, or you can become a patron at patreon.com. The links are in the description, so thank you very much. So what are we going to look at today? High speed prevention and recovery. We'll have a look at the techniques. We're going to take a look at some articles and review the FCTM, and then we'll have a look at some prevention methods in terms of the information that the pilots have in order to identify areas where perhaps we might be at risk. I mentioned the 3 articles. These are from the Safety First magazine, and as I mentioned in the heads up video, that you can have access to this, or have accessibility to this yourselves if you want to download the app, or can just find the articles online, and hopefully you might have done that prior to releasing of this video. But if not, doesn't matter, I'm going to go through them with you in any case. So the first articles we're going to have a look at, and to start with, just have a base level of our knowledge on the system, is an article, Control Your Speed in a Cruise. In there we have a look at some really important definitions. Firstly, we're going to take a look at the definition of green dot, how that's made up and why it's really important, particularly with high altitude flight, and the importance to remain above green dot. And that's important when we look at the high-speed recovery technique and the importance of remaining above green dot. So I've got some information there in this article to add a little bit of meat to the bone on that meaning and definition. Then we're going to take a look at the all-important VMO/MMO. We'll take a look at crossover altitude, low altitude VMO/MMO and how it's calculated, and VD/MD, risks at high and low altitude, and the fact that actually high altitude speed excursions, or airspeed excursions, are less of a threat than potentially at low altitude, and I explain why that is. In the second article, we look at management of overspeed events in the cruise. We'll take a look at some flight data analysis. We'll take a look and remind ourselves of aircraft capabilities, and we take a look at recommended techniques, prevention and recovery. So there's a reminder in there of the actual technique. It's taken from the Airbus Techniques manual, and there's some nice graphic illustrations in there as well, which I think are quite useful, or very useful in fact. And then we'll take a look at an actual overspeed event. And then lastly, identifying weather phenomena that may likely pose a threat to an aircraft, significant speed variations, and the information that is available to pilots. So that's what we're going to have a look at today. It's going to be in this kind of podcast kind of format, with some illustrations as well to help. So let's get straight into it. Okay, so the first article we're going to have a look at is Control Your Speed in the Cruise. And just as a reminder here, we're going to take a look at specifically at green dot and why this is important to remain above green dot, particularly when recovering, excuse me, that's my phone, recovering from high speed events. And then we'll go on to VMO, MMO, etc. So let's take a look at that now. But just as an overview here, there's a very nice intro into these sort of characteristic speeds as a headline for Control Your Speed in the cruise. So let's just have a look over it. I'm just going to read this into it and add a little bit of gravity and meat to the bone and some context to it as we go along. But this is essentially, taken straight from the article itself. So if you haven't read it, you can just follow along with me now. So technically, cruising consists of heading changes and aircraft systems monitoring, fuel in particular, at relatively constant airspeed and altitude. It ends as the aircraft approaches the destination where the descent commences in preparation for landing. Speed monitoring and control are crucial during this phase of flight to guarantee that the aircraft flies within its certified flight envelope at all times, and any threats to the airspeed can be properly managed. This article will not immerse readers into the challenge of optimizing the aircraft performance in the cruise, but will aim at shedding more light on the existing threats to airspeed during the cruise, as well as some good practices to best manage them. I think that's really what this is all about. While planning their cruise to make the right speed and level choices, the flight crew needs to remain vigilant to speed excursions and be able to recover if needed. Now, I'm going to focus more about those speed excursions, or on those speed excursions, more than I am about optimum cruise levels. But if you really want to know how cruise levels are calculated, optimal cruise levels, design cruise levels, this article is excellent, but it goes beyond the scope of what I want to talk about. Okay, so I'm not going to cover everything out here. I'm just going to cover the green dot and the VMO, MMO, and actually VLS is one other item I'm going to look at as well, because again, that's really important when we talk about the speed recovery, high speed recovery. So managing your speed and understanding these speeds. Speed in the cruise is often driven by performance and fuel burn considerations. However, air traffic or weather considerations sometimes intervene and require modification to the optimum cruise profile. I think we've all been there, haven't we, where ATC asks us to descend or see if we can maintain a higher climb, or indeed if we're trying to climb above weather when perhaps our optimum cruise level was relatively low for a relatively short space of time. So our intervention is required, but of course we must keep on top of the optimum performance of the aircraft. Whatever the flight crew's decision to best optimise their flight, one needs to be constantly aware of the applicable limits and manoeuvring speeds. To safely manage the cruise phase within the aircraft's certified flight envelope, some characteristic speeds are useful reference for flight crews to monitor the actual aircraft speed. What speeds exactly should be monitored? What do these speeds mean? And what happens if they are ignored? And that's really the crux of what this is all about. Many speeds are used to certify and fly an aircraft operationally. For every flight, the applicable characteristic speeds are computed automatically by the auto flight systems, basically the FMS. Flight guidance and flight envelope FE are displayed on the PFD airspeed scale. That's all your characteristic speeds that you'll see. They are extremely useful as target manoeuvring and limit referencing speeds to safely guide the pilot's navigation decisions throughout the cruise phase. Our objective is to highlight the design and operational considerations underlying all recommendations Airbus has issued to flight crews regarding the monitoring of these speeds in the cruise. So the first one we're going to take a look at is manoeuvring speed, green dot, and really what it means, and just a revision of some of the sort of flight dynamics and flight laws that are associated with green dot. And much of this you'll remember from some of your ATPL ground school. For some of us, that was a long time ago. For some of you, that will be fairly recent knowledge. So probably a good idea to review it. And green dot's really important in this. Green dot was presented already in the previous article related to the climb phase, but we haven't looked at that, so I'm not going to go over that. Nevertheless, it's important to have this speed in mind during the cruise phase because it is a clearly visible reference speed on the PFD airspeed scale. I said I'm not going to go over it, but the green dot article in there, I have read it in the past, and it's actually quite a useful reference, and how green dot changes as we increase our Mach number, and the importance of maintaining above green dot in the climb. So I'm not going to go into it here, but you know, a useful read if you ever get time. We will see thereafter why pilots should not routinely fly slower than green dot in the cruise, and for this reason a recap of green dot definition is provided hereafter, as well as the consequences of flying lower than green dot in the cruise. The green dot, as we know, is the best lift to drag ratio speed. Let's take a look at the definition. Green dot speed is the engine out operating speed in clean configuration. It corresponds to the speed that allows the highest climb gradient with one engine inoperative in clean configuration. In all cases, all engines operative, the green dot speed gives an estimate of the best speed to lift drag ratio. It's represented by the green dot on the PFD, we've all seen that, and the PFD speed scale, and displays only when the slats and flaps are in zero, basically when the aircraft's in clean configuration. Good. Okay. How is green dot determined? This is quite a useful description here. So green dot speed is computed by the auto flight system and is based on the aircraft weight, thanks to the zero fuel weight inserted during FMS preparation by the crew. That's why the zero fuel weight is very important. The green dot formula has to be set up so that the resulting airspeed provides the best lift to drag ratio for a given altitude, Mach number, and aircraft weight in the clean configuration, with one engine out. In the cruise, above green dot, the drag and the thrust required to maintain speed increases with speed. Below green dot, the drag and thrust required to maintain speed increase with speed decrease, which is the second regime. So that's going to sound a little bit complicated here. And there's a very nice illustration and a graph here of where green dot is, the bottom of the drag curve, and what happens when we slip aft of the drag curve. So as the speed reduces, the drag increases, and depending on the altitude that you're at, you'll probably find, or you will find, that you reach a point where maximum attainable thrust is now no longer able to support the significant increase in drag. When we get above green dot, we have excess thrust available, but of course, whilst the drag increases, then that's able to slow the airplane down to bring the speed back into a more normal flight regime. And of course, you've got available thrust there in order to increase as necessary to get yourself above green dot. The risk here when you go below green dot, drag significantly increases with speed reduction, and you can run out of thrust available. There's a nice diagram in there, and I'll include that in this description. So it talks more about this in terms of the first or second regime. So at a given altitude, temperature, weight and thrust, figure 2 shows 2 points on the equilibrium where thrust precisely compensates for drag. Thrust equals drag, and stabilized flight is possible. Point 1, where VC is lower than green dot, and point 2, where VC is higher than green dot. So let's take a closer look at the aircraft behaviour if the speed is moving away from these speeds. So looking at the diagram more closely, when you look at area 2 or point 2, is a stable equilibrium in the cruise. This is where we want to be, nicely above green dot. Where the aircraft flies at this point 2, the airspeed is stabilised. Small variations of airspeed will naturally be compensated for the aircraft, and it will return to point 2. At point 2, the aircraft flies in the first regime. If a disturbance increases the aircraft speed above point 2, then the drag increases. Consequently, the aircraft will decelerate back to equilibrium point 2. That is assuming that there's no increase in thrust. If a disturbance reduces the speed below point 2, then the drag decreases. This generates an acceleration, and the aircraft speed will naturally increase back to equilibrium point 2. Is that making sense now? So you can see here where green dot is, you can see point 2, and you can see where the drag would increase, the speed would come back, and if the speed was to reduce, the reduction in drag will mean that the speed will come back to point 2 again. So that's the nice stable equilibrium. Point 1 is now an unstable equilibrium, and at this point the aircraft flies in the second regime. If a disturbance increases the aircraft speed above point 1, the drag reduces, therefore the aircraft will continue to accelerate towards point 2. If a disturbance reduces the aircraft speed below 0.1, then the drag becomes increasingly higher. If no action is taken, the aircraft will naturally be induced to a continuous deceleration. To stop the deceleration, to be able to accelerate again, two scenarios are possible. When the speed reduces below 0.1 and remains higher than 0.3, if more thrust or maximum thrust available is applied, then the aircraft can accelerate. There's some spare energy there. When the speed reduces below 0.3, there's no thrust margin available to accelerate while maintaining a stabilized level flight. The only way to stop the deceleration is to lose altitude in order to accelerate beyond 0.3. So to sum it up, faster than green dot, the aircraft flies in the first regime, and this is stable with regards to speed. Slower than green dot, the aircraft flies in the second regime and is unstable with regards to speed. Below green dot, we're unstable. Above green dot, we're stable. That's why it's important to remain above green dot. And we'll look at that more when we come to the recovery technique. Good. Okay, so do I want to go any further into this? Let me just have a look at this last bit of this article, because then it talks about how's recommended maximum attained, and I'm not going to go into that. So 0.3 is not displayed on the PFD airspeed scale, only green dot is shown. Okay, so that's our only reference. The higher the aircraft, the lower the maximum thrust available. This means that at high altitude, close to recommended max, 0.3 and green dot are close to each other because the thrust margin is small. This is all to do with high altitude flight. Therefore, flying below green dot in level flight could easily drive the aircraft slower than 0.3, which is obviously where we don't want to be, and eventually in a continuous deceleration. Consequently, in clean configuration, in cruise, the crew should not fly below green dot. Exceptionally, if flight slightly below green dot is required for some reason, then vigilant monitoring is necessary to ensure that further commanded speed reductions are immediately checked and recovered from. So there's a bit of a government health warning there, flying below green dot. Good. Okay, so then the article goes on to how is a recommended maximum altitude computed. It goes on to talk about absolute aerodynamic altitude, maximum certified, aerodynamic ceiling, service ceiling. Yeah, there's a lot in there, and you can read that. You can read and understand. I don't really want to go into it because it's beyond what I want to talk about here. And there's a couple of nice graphs here. There's some definitions here about the green dot altitude, the Buffett recommended at 1.3 G, where we'll get vertical speed at 300 feet a minute, VMO, MMO, etc. So there's lots of good information in there. I want to now go on to some of the limiting speeds. I'm not going to talk about VLS, lower selectable speed, because we pretty much know what that is. Lower speed selectable with the auto thrust engaged. But I want to talk a little bit about the effects of VLS when we're using speed brake, because that's an important part of the recovery as well. So what have we got here? So VS1G is a stall speed demonstrated by flight tests. The formula means that VLS is higher when the speed brakes are extended, since the speed brake extension increases VS1G. So what do we mean by that? VLS is 1.23 VS1G in the clean configuration. That's what we're going to be talking about in a high level flight. And because the speed brake extension increases the speed, increases the stall speed, then that's why you see an increase in your VLS when you apply the speed brake. And that's actually quite significant, particularly well, at any altitude really. You'll notice that. And next time when you're in the simulator, if you've got time, just have a little play with that and just see the significance of it, particularly if you are dealing with overspeed events as part of your training package. Deliberately flying below VLS could either lead to an activation of the angle of attack protection on a protected aircraft, or expose the aircraft to a stall if not protected, i.e. flying in degraded law. And we look at that briefly when we have a look at the event later on in the third part of this series. Did you know? On the A320 family, speed brake extension and retraction rates at high Mach are roughly twice as slow with the autopilot engaged compared with the autopilot disengaged. As a consequence, if used to avoid VMO/MMO exceedance, crews should keep this in mind to retract them in a timely order in order to avoid reducing their speed below green dot. This is particularly true when flying close to recommended max. So there you go. There's a statement which explains the fact that the retraction is much slower. We've already mentioned that they take up to 25 seconds with full speed brake, and the importance to retract them in a timely manner so as not to have the speed decay below green dot. Okay, so crossover altitude. This is where we cross over from IAS to or TAS, I should say, to Mach number, and where Mach number becomes more relevant. So let's take a look at this. The crossover altitude is an aircraft normally flies at an optimal indicated airspeed until they reach their optimal climb cruise Mach. The transition between airspeed and Mach occurs at a point called the crossover altitude, usually between 25 and 300, depending on the aircraft type. When the aircraft climbs to the crossover altitude at a constant IAS, the Mach increases, and you'll remember this from your ground school with your RTM curves. When the aircraft climbs to the crossover altitude at constant IAS, the Mach increases. The opposite happens in the descent to the crossover altitude at a constant Mach. Then the IAS will then increase. At altitudes above the crossover altitude, pilots will fly a Mach number instead of IAS. It becomes a more meaningful parameter because then we're limited by Mach. Different phenomena exist according to the speed or Mach the aircraft flies at. The aerodynamic world can therefore be split into two areas, low and high Mach numbers. At high Mach number, when accelerating beyond MMO, slight vibrations may appear. These are vibrations due to an unsteady early onset shock waves developing on the wing's upper surface. These shock waves significantly worsen the drag and can alter the aircraft's controllability. Remember Chuck Yeager? He was experimenting with Mach flight, wasn't he? He was talking about flutter and this, that, and the other. That was a great film. But this phenomena has nothing to do with Buffett announcing lack of lift to come or an approaching stall. Airbus airplanes operated up to VD and MD are not exposed to the so-called high-speed Buffett. That's an important thing to take away because VD and MD is well beyond VMO, MMO. So just to read that again, Airbus airplanes operated up to VD and MD, which is what they do in the flight tests, are not exposed to the so-called high-speed Buffett. That's quite interesting and very relevant later on. At high indicated airspeed, high IAS, the main threat to the aircraft structural integrity lies in the dynamic pressure exerted on air on the structure. Aircraft controllability remains optimum as long as the Mach number is not too high. In practice, the aircraft is designed to be safe up to speeds well above VMO MMO. Indeed, according to specific certification requirements, the aircraft must be safe to fly up to the design limited speeds. That's our speed limits and Mach limits, VD, MD. So they're your design speed and design Mach. In other words, up to VD, MD, the aircraft remains controllable and free of any flutter. And that is a significant margin beyond VMO, MMO. So the picture I'm kind of painting here, or as this documentation is suggesting, is that if the aircraft does reach VMO, MMO, there's no panic. The aircraft is designed to actually fly operationally up to VD, MD without any sort of significant effects on controllability of the aircraft and remains controllable and free of any flutter. So there's no real drama. That's not taking away from what we need to be super careful about it. Of course we do. But just to put some context to it. So how is VMO MMO determined? VMO MMO is established with regard to the aircraft structural limits, and it provides a margin to the design limit speed or Mach number VD MD. VDMD must be sufficiently above VMO-MMO to make it highly improbable that VDMD will be inadvertently exceeded in commercial operations. Makes sense, doesn't it? If you want to design an aircraft, you want the parameters of normal flight to be well below the actual design limits of the aircraft in order for certification. Several certification criteria exist as a result. On Airbus aircraft, MD is usually equal to MMO plus 0.07, and VD is equal to approximately VMO plus 35 knots. I mean, that's way into your protection. The applicable VMO MMO are indicated on each aircraft flight manual. We don't have access to that, or at least I haven't been able to locate it. But for example, the VMO MMO and VDMD are given in the following table, and I'll put that up here for you, so we can have a look along here. Now, I don't know if these are FCOM tables from the AFM or not. I don't know their source, but as it's produced by Airbus, I think we can say it's reliable. So the A320 family, we know that VMO, MMO is 350 and 0.82 respectively. VD and MD is 381 and 0.89. So yeah, I mean, you can see here, significant margin before we even get to the sort of designed limit. So that's my phone telling my son wants me to pick him up significantly earlier than was planned. That is life and having children. VD is a calibrated airspeed during flight tests. VD, MD are reached by test pilots with the objective to demonstrate that the aircraft's structural integrity is not to put at stake these speeds. Yeah, okay. And the aircraft remains safely recoverable at all times. The article High Altitude Manual Flying that was published on the 20th issue of this magazine provides a good explanation of the manoeuvre performed by test pilots to determine these speeds. Now, I'm going to cover that in a separate article. It's very techy, but it's very good. But for those of you that are super techy in high altitude performance in general, it's a really good read. And we are going to cover that, but I've back-squatted that quite a bit because we've got a lot of other material to cover, but I am going to take a look at that, so that'll be sometime in the future. If you want to look at it earlier, then let me know, and if we get enough people asking for it, I might bring it forward up the profile. So key points to remember are: reaching VD is much easier than reaching MD. At high altitude, reaching the aircraft's structural limit is almost impossible. I mean, that is a huge take home. At lower altitudes, i.e. below the crossover altitude, that was about 250, wasn't it, up to 300 depending on the aircraft type, reaching VD is possible because of the available thrust is higher and drag is due to Mach effects is much lower. So let's listen to that again. At high altitude, reaching the aircraft's structural limit is almost impossible. So when we're looking at overspeed events, you have to really go somewhere to get towards VD because there isn't the excess thrust available. You would need some significant environmental conditions to suddenly create a condition that would get the aircraft to VD. Airbus actually talk about this, and that you'd have to throw the nose forward with full thrust to get anywhere near 8MD. Whereas VD, which is lower altitude, below the crossover altitude, is more achievable or attainable, or is of a greater risk. Let's not set it as a target, hey? Is of greater risk because you have that excess thrust available and you don't have the Mach effects associated with it. So, yeah, I think that's a really great take home. So, what are the operational implications for not respecting VMO, MMO? JAR and FAR 45 rule dictates that VMO or MMO may not be deliberately exceeded in any regime of flight. The parameter VMO, MMO basically sets upper boundaries to the aircraft speed envelope. Crews should keep in mind that at high altitude, whilst it is important to always respect MMO, a slight and temporary Mach increase above that value will not lead the aircraft to an immediate hazardous situation. Again, this is why we'll talk about the technique later on. We don't want to panic into a situation and suddenly take over because we can do more damage than good. At lower altitude, exceeding VMO by a significant amount is a real threat and can dramatically affect the integrity of the aircraft structure. Although intentional VMO-MMO exceedances cases are rare, this limit speed can typically be overshot when the aircraft is subject to an unusual wind and/or temperature gradient. Prevention is therefore essential. So I spoke about in the heads up on this is the prevention of the prevention is better than the recovery. So yeah. We'll take a look at some of those details later on, and some of those prevention some of those prevention methods. Okay, the article then goes on to V Alpha Prot. I don't want to talk about that. And then it talks about how V Alpha Prot and V Alpha Max are determined. If you're a math wizard, then you can read that. I have no clue what that formula means, and I'm not even going to attempt to explain it because I don't know what it means, but that tells you how alpha prot. It's beyond what we're trying to talk about today. And then there comes on to this nice diagram here and this nice picture which talks about the operational limits of the airplane and the design limits of the airplane. So you've got some areas of where the operational aircraft, and you've got the high speed and the low speed, and where the aircraft is actually flight tested too. And that's a nice little overview there of how much, God, dare I say how much fat there is in operational. I shouldn't really say that, should I? But give you some confidence of that when the flight test is way beyond what we should see as pilots in our operational daily lives. Operational recommendations. I'm just going to read a couple of things out here. At high altitude, reaching the aircraft's structural limit Mach number is almost impossible, except in a steep dive with maximum thrust. Therefore, at high altitude, flying at high Mach number should not be viewed as the biggest threat to flight safety. On the other hand, I'm reading a bit later on here, talking about lower altitudes. On the other hand, at low altitude, reaching VMO and VD is possible. Therefore, high speed should be viewed indeed as a significant threat to safety. I think we covered that already, and that's a bit of a summary there in managing your cruise speed excursions operational recommendations. There's quite a lot of information. It then goes on to gaining good awareness of weather, altitude and wind gradients, the main contributing factors, and then preventing a speed decay, detecting the phenomenon. And then it goes on again to alpha protections and buffet, etc., which I'm not going to talk about. But in terms of weather phenomena, I am going to talk about, but I'll talk about that a little bit later on because there's some really good stuff in there. Good. Right, I'm going to pause for a drink. And I'm going to have to plan how I'm going to go and get my son now, almost 2 hours earlier than he told me he was going to. And then we're going to take a look at the other articles in the description. Management of overspeed events in the cruise. So I'll talk to you about that in just a moment. Okay, so that puts a bit of context. Control your speed in the cruise. It's a bit of context to what green dot means. VMO, MMO, VD, MD, etc. So there's a nice margin in there. So there's no need to panic if we get into an overspeed event. So let's move on now to the flight data analysis. And what we're going to be looking at here is the flight data analysis itself from Airbus. That's information and data which has been presented to Airbus. Aircraft capabilities and the recommended techniques of both prevention and recovery. So Airbus studied the data provided by operators for over 1 million flights to gain an insight into overspeed management in actual operational conditions. This study indicates there are about 1 Vmax exceedance every 1,400 flights. That's quite a lot, I think, which demonstrates that overspeed events occur frequently. Temporary overspeed scenarios are more often occurring in the cruise phase, where the aircraft can be subject to changing wind conditions. So this is all about environmental changes. And whilst an MMO exceedance is less hazardous potentially than a VMO exceedance, we said earlier on. Most of them occur in the cruise because of those environmental conditions. So managing overspeed, the importance of applying the recommended technique. The analysis showed that the handling of overspeed is not always done in accordance with the recommended techniques provided by the Flight Crew Techniques Manual, the FCTM. Focusing on flights with Vmax exceedance, the following can be highlighted. Numerous manual autopilot disconnections. So when they talk about Vmax, reading between the lines here, it's the maximum speed. So that can be VMO or MMO. So I think they've grouped them together. So numerous manual autopilot disconnections. In 25% of these flights, the flight crew disconnects the autopilot and takes over control of the aircraft. So several cases of abrupt and large control inputs during manual takeover leading to a significant altitude deviation were also reported to Airbus. No reduction of speed target. In 30% of these flights, speed target is not reduced to increase margins when approaching Vmax. And no use of speed brakes. In 60% of these flights, which is huge really, speed brakes were not used to prevent or manage overspeed. So, yeah, there's a lot going on there, isn't there? So, autopilot disconnects, no reduction of speed, and no use of speed brakes. So, that's to do with Vmax exceedance, nothing to do with prevention. So, yeah, that's an actual overspeed event, so not following the guidance in the FCTM. Okay, that's actually quite significant, I think. So aircraft capabilities, I've read this out at the beginning as the intro, but I'll read it out again. In the cruise, a VMO MMO provides a significant margin to design limits. All Airbus aircraft are designed and tested to be safe to fly up to designed limit speed, which is a value with margin well above VMO MMO at cruising altitude. There is therefore no need to rush in taking over manually when the aircraft reaches VMO MMO. So there's no need to disconnect the autopilot. The autopilot is robust to overspeed. The autopilot will remain engaged throughout most of the overspeed events encountered in the cruise. The autopilot will only automatically disconnect if there is a large or prolonged VMO MMO exceedance. So quite interesting stats there, I think. But so leading on from here, the fly-by-wire aircraft with the aircraft in its overspeed situation, as long as the autopilot is engaged, the high-speed protection is not active, and the autopilot flight objectives remain unchanged. So its flight directives or its objectives then is to follow the flight guidance, which is FMGC, which is the altitude hold and speed hold. With the auto thrust engaged, the autopilot will automatically disconnect if the high-speed protection activates. The high-speed protection will command the appropriate pitch up input, which we know, as we discussed in normal law, is the protection in normal law, and how that works. Inspection following an overspeed event. Aircraft inspection is only required when the speed exceeds VMO by 20 knots. Or MMO plus 0.02. That's for the A330-340 aircraft, and 0.04 for the A320 family. There have been no findings reported following inspections performed after overspeed events on Airbus fly-by-wire aircraft. So again, some more confidence there. So let's have a look then at the recommended technique. But before I do that, let's just go back on this and just recap here about the autopilot being robust to overspeed, particularly when looking at this data analysis that numerous autopilot disconnects, no reduction of speed target and no use of speed base. The autopilot will remain engaged throughout most of the overspeed events encountered in the cruise. It will only disconnect if there is a large or prolonged VMO MMO exceedance. So that's all to do with the parameters of the protection itself in terms of when that actually disconnects. So the quote that I gave you about 15 knots is in our FCOM, but again, this is all going to depend largely on the size and the nature of that VMO exceedance, and largely the autopilot should stay engaged. So there's no immediate rush. So let's have a look at the recommended techniques. The Flight Crew Techniques Manual provides efficient techniques to prevent and recover from an overspeed situation. So the overspeed prevention technique, and then we talk about the overspeed recovery technique, okay, because the two are obviously different. We want to prevent the prevention, which then prevents the recovery. We talk about how we do that later on. But let's have a look at the actual overspeed prevention technique. So we're preventing the speed from increasing to the point where we exceed VMO, MMO. So the Flight Crew Techniques Manual provides efficient techniques to prevent and recover from an overspeed situation. So the prevention techniques, the following overspeed prevention technique must be applied in the case of significant speed variations close to VMO, MMO. So environmental conditions that may cause that close to the exceedance. So keep the autopilot and the auto thrust on. That's the first thing. The autopilot maintains the aircraft on the intended flight path, and the auto thrust will automatically command idle thrust. That is an auto thrust protection. That is why keeping the autopilot and auto thrust on during an overspeed event minimises altitude excursion and reduces the crew workload. Makes sense. The next thing to do is select a lower speed target. The selection of a lower speed target increases the margin to VMO, MMO. The selected speed must remain above green dot speed to avoid any speed decay. So just going back to when we were talking about green dot and what it means and why it's critically important that we remain above green dot so that we're in that speed stable part of the drag curve. If you reduce the speed below green dot, then that's going to have some significant implications. And the last thing, then monitor the speed trend arrow and use the speed brakes if necessary. At any time when the speed trend arrow approaches or exceeds VMO, MMO, the flight crew should use the speed brakes to decelerate the aircraft. The use of speed brakes is the most efficient way to decelerate the aircraft without destabilizing its trajectory. One thing I will say here is that this is obviously the correct technique, but just remember to stow the speed brakes at an appropriate time, because the speed brake retraction rate takes some time, and what's quoted in the FCOM when we looked at flight controls and we looked at spoilers, up to 25 seconds can take for them to fully retract with full speed brake deployment, and your speed in this event will reduce fairly quickly at idle thrust and the speed brake out. So do remember to put that back at an appropriate time to not allow the speed to decay too much, particularly as we're getting towards green dot again. This is really important because, flying heavy aircraft at high altitude, there's not much margin there between sort of low and high speed. So just take care with that. Overspeed recovery technique we're going to move on to now. So the flight crew must apply the overspeed recovery technique if speed exceeds VMO, MMO. The first thing here is keep autopilot and auto thrust on. Again, there's a re-emphasis here. The autopilot being robust to overspeed situation, the flight crew must not disconnect manually the autopilot and auto thrust in the case of an overspeed situation. Manual takeover should be limited to the cases where the high speed protection activates and automatically disconnects the autopilot. This is to make sure that the correct technique is applied, but also to avoid any excessive G loading when we come to the recovery. And we take a look at that in the event which occurred, and we talk about after this discussion, we look at an overspeed event with a crew takeover. I'll lean on that a little bit more later on. The use of speed brakes will reduce the Vmax exceedance and the duration. Excuse me. Using speed brakes can help prevent reaching the speed threshold that causes the high speed protection to activate and the autopilot then to disconnect. There's something here about the 350. The speed brakes fully extend at VMO plus 5 automatically, regardless of position of the speed brake lever. That's quite interesting, isn't it? We're getting a lot of updates from and new software upgrades, if you like, to the A320, which are coming from the A350. So it wouldn't surprise me if we look at how overspeed events are being mishandled, if we look at the statistics and the analysis released by Airbus, if an automatic speed brake application might actually come down and be retrofitted to the A320 perhaps, or for the new 320 Neos that are being launched. But we'll have to see about that. But that makes sense, really. And the last thing then, so keep the autopilot and auto thrust on, use the speed brakes, and then monitor idle thrust on the engine display EWD. The flight crew should monitor that the auto thrust commands idle thrust on the EWD, or set the thrust levers to idle if the auto thrust is disconnected. And a nice little picture here showing an illustration here of the three important the procedure here for the recovery technique, with the autopilot, auto thrust on, the use of speed brake, and monitoring idle thrust. So the next question is then, well, what happens, or what to do if the high speed protection activates and disconnects the autopilot? On fly-by-wire aircraft, the autopilot may automatically disconnect due to the activation of the high-speed protection. In this case, the aircraft reverts in manual flight with the high-speed protection active. The high-speed protection is designed to target VMO, MMO stick-free and to limit the excursion beyond VMO, MMO when a full forward stick input is applied. So this goes back to normal flight control laws, and we looked at high-speed protection, and you can override the high-speed protection. If you do nothing, stick-free, it will command VMO, MMO, and to limit the exceedance even with full forward stick. And the idea of that, if you wanted to avoid a TCAS incident, say for example, and you needed forward stick and you needed to descend, the speed would increase, but the high-speed protection will minimise that excursion. When the Mach or speed decreases close to VMO, MMO, the high-speed protection deactivates and the aircraft remains in manual flight. And that's when we would need then to re-engage the autopilot. In the case of automatic autopilot disconnection due to high-speed protection, the flight crew can smoothly adjust the pitch attitude but without overreacting, especially at high altitude, and should keep the speed brakes extended because they are compatible with the high-speed protection. So there you go. If the autopilot disconnects due to the high-speed activation, smoothly adjust the pitch, disregard the flight director orders, and then keep the speed brakes extended until such time as the speed is back under control. Once the aircraft speed decreases below VMO, MMO, the flight crew should apply the following steps. Retract the speed brakes when appropriate. Retracting the speed brakes too early could lead to a reoccurrence of the VMO, MMO exceedance, but retracting too late may cause a speed decay. That's what I was talking to you about earlier on, is how long it takes for the speed brakes to retract. Adjust your speed target as necessary. The flight crew should adjust the speed target to increase the margin to VMO, MMO if the risk of overspeed due to the external conditions remain, but ensure that the speed target is set above green dots. So there's another reminder there. If the auto thrust is off, the flight crew should manually adjust the thrust levers and re-engage the auto thrust. Then re-engage the autopilot if it was disconnected. If the autopilot was previously disconnected due to the high-speed protection, the flight crew should recover the flight path smoothly and re-engage the autopilot. So retract the speed brakes, adjust the speed target as necessary, and re-engage the autopilot and auto thrust. Nice and simple. So overspeed scenarios often occur in the cruise due to the changing wind conditions. Applying the recommended overspeed prevention and recovery techniques in the FCTM reduces the risks of aircraft altitude variation and minimises the flight crew's workload when managing overspeed events. On Airbus aircraft, the autopilot is designed to cope with temporary overspeed situations. The high-speed protection will disconnect the autopilot and provide optimum pitch-up command to slow the aircraft only in the case of a large and prolonged overspeed. Flight crew should not manually disconnect the autopilot in anticipation of a high-speed protection activation. In the case of an autopilot disconnection following a high-speed protection activation, the flight crew must apply smooth pitch inputs to avoid sudden inappropriate and excessive control inputs with their inherent consequences on aircraft trajectory. Keeping the autopilot on and the auto thrust on, combined with the optimal use of the speed brakes, enables a smooth and safe recovery from an overspeed event in the cruise. Could not have put it better myself. I definitely couldn't have. Okay, so moving on then to the last in the publications in flight safety operations. We're going to identify, we're going to take a look at this overspeed event, and then lastly, we're going to identify the sort of weather phenomena, the things that might likely pose a threat to the aircraft, etc., significant speed variations, and the information that's available to pilots. This overspeed event is entitled Overspeed Event with Crew Takeover. That's the important part. And OEB 49 application. I'm not going to talk about OEB 49. It doesn't apply to our aircraft, I believe. Well, this was a 330. Just to remind you, OEB 48, I think it was, on the 320 aircraft concerned abnormal alpha protection. And the crew in this instance believed that they were in this flight regime when in fact they weren't. But I'm going to take bits out of here, if I can, relevant to what we're talking about, because I think there are some good take-home points in here. I'm not going to discuss the OEB 48 or OEB 49. Certainly for our aircraft, it no longer exists because we've had the vanes retrofitted and an ELAC upgrade, and I can only presume that is the case for the rest of the A320 fleet around the world. I don't know, because I'm not a fleet technical man, and I'm not your fleet technical man either in your airline, so I wouldn't know. If you want to know more about this, you can read it in the Safety First edition 28, which was in June 2019. If you still have OEB 48 or 49 applicable to your aircraft, I'd be surprised, I've got to be honest, because it went some while ago now. But anyway, I just add that. So, description of the event: an overspeed in the cruise due to a tailwind drop. Well, that's not uncommon, is it really? Suddenly you're going into a significant headwind. This involved an A340 aircraft. It doesn't matter if it's an A319, 20, 30, 40, 50 or 80. It makes no difference. This can happen anywhere. So an A340 aircraft was flying at 380 with a managed speed Mach number of 0.82 and with a tailwind of around 64 knots. Not uncommon. Prior to reaching the top of the descent, a sudden drop in tailwind of 41 knots in 14 seconds caused a significant airspeed increase and triggered overspeed warning for 9 seconds despite the thrust reduction commanded by the auto thrust. So auto thrust doing its job there, but it's still, there was an exceedance, and you can see a nice picture here to illustrate that. It's what happened next is the problem. So, and what's the meat of this really? Manual autopilot disconnection with large pitch up side stick input and selection of a low Mach target. So the first thing that happened was the autopilot disconnection. The second thing that happened was a large pitch up. And the third thing was a low Mach target. I think actually below green dot in this case, but I'll read on anyway. So the captain reacted to the overspeed warning by manually disconnecting the autopilot and then by applying large pitch up inputs on the side stick, and the speed brakes were not used. The flight crew then selected a Mach number of 0.7, which actually corresponds to an airspeed below VLS. So that's significant, isn't it? Bearing in mind what we were talking about earlier on about the importance of remaining above green dot. And we can't use the excuse of the fact that the VLS would have been increased because of speed brakes, because they weren't applied. The aircraft consequently started to climb at a pitch rate, it calls it the pitch rate here, but a vertical speed of 5,700 feet a minute. So that is significant at that level. The speed was decreasing with a thruster idle in accordance with the selected Mach. Now this is where it starts to get a little bit complicated, because now it's what starts talking about the OEB 49. So dual ADR switch off, alternate law loss, and the auto thrust protections and the flight director. So the flight crew erroneously applied the OEB 49 procedure and switched off the ADR2 and ADR3. About 15 seconds later, autopilot disconnection. About 15 seconds after the autopilot disconnection. So they disconnected the autopilot, responded to it. That was their performance. And then the two ADRs were switched off some 15 seconds after the autopilot disconnection. This caused the aircraft to revert to alternate law, the loss of the flight director bar's disconnection of the auto thrust. As a consequence, the thrust remained at the current value, which was at idle, and they saw thrust lock. The thrust maintained its position where it was last set at idle until it was moved again. Engine thrust lock, ECAM, etc., etc. And then 32 seconds of climb with idle thrust until they reached the stall warning. Both ADRs were put back on, and then very uneventful. Can you say uneventful, really? Anyway, they recovered from the stall, and then they landed safely without further event. So, as I say, I'm not going to dwell on that ADR thing, but there's a lot of take homes here. So, analysis of the flight data highlights two main aspects of this event: the handling of the overspeed, which was what we're concerned about, and the improper application of OEB 49. So let's talk about the overspeed handling then. During this event, the flight crew disconnected the autopilot following the overspeed warning. However, the autopilot is robust to overspeed situations. So they were seeing that sentence again. The autopilot automatically disconnects only when the filtered Mach becomes higher than MMO plus a margin. Depending on the aircraft type, there are some numbers here. The filtered Mach is a smooth and slightly delayed Mach, which dampens any abrupt variations of the current Mach and makes the autopilot even more robust to automatic disconnection. So it's kind of a mushed speed indication, I suppose, rather than instantaneous. So it makes it less jumpy. Simulations show that if the autopilot had been left engaged, it would have remained engaged during this event, and as a result, the aircraft would have stayed on its trajectory. They wouldn't have applied the OEB in the incorrect manner, they wouldn't have stalled the aeroplane, and it would have been largely a non-event. If you exceed the MMO, leave the autopilot and the auto thrust in. It is robust in handling overspeed excursions. Good. Okay, the very last thing I'm going to talk about, this has gone on a long time. The very last thing we're going to talk about is some of the information we can get as pilots on our OFP to help us identify some of those areas that might pose a risk to speed exceedance VMO MMO. Okay, so how do we anticipate a speed excursion? What information have we got available to us to, if you like, mitigate the need for prevention and recovery? Ultimately, prevention is better than the cure, isn't it? So I'll just read from the Safety magazine here, edition 21 on January 16, which is a continuation from Managing Your Speed in the Cruise. So clearly flight crews are expected to be able to rapidly scan the essential and relevant parameters in every situation, in every flight phase, including dynamic manoeuvres. In most cases, speed excursion situations are due to rapid wind and or temperature variations or evolutions. Gaining good awareness of weather is important, and weather is an important factor that influences aircraft performances, be it a local flight or a long-haul flight. Decisions based on weather can dramatically affect the safety of the flight. We as pilots have our operational flight plan. We have SIGMET charts. We can see where the CBs are. We can see where the jet streams are. And we can see where the turbulence might be. We have shear rates available to us. So there's a lot of information there that will help us give us better situational awareness of the environment that we're in, and particularly places to avoid, particularly where we have high convective activity leading up to the tropopause, which is going to significantly impact our routing. So as it turns out, the first external threat to airspeed comes from weather disturbances such as turbulent areas that can lead to significant speed changes. Common sense generally makes pilots avoid those areas. However, they sometimes end up in situations where some solid turbulence is encountered, But let's be honest, clear air turbulence isn't always predictable, and by its nature it can be somewhat unpredictable, but usually there are some warning signs there. When dodging thunderstorms, for example, at this point the airspeed begins to fluctuate, thus making speed exceedance or speed decay more likely. Such situations need to be planned ahead as far as possible, avoided through regular scanning of weather conditions and flight path adaptation. The first key to preventing speed excursions events is gaining awareness of the applicable weather predictions along the forecasted route. And as I mentioned earlier on, we have that, and that's something we discuss in the flight planning phase. Before takeoff, the weather briefing has to be complete as possible. Pilots should check weather reports at the alternate and destination airports, and depending on the weather context, this information needs to be updated in flight as often as necessary. Weather information can be communicated either by air traffic controllers or by other crews flying in the area. So listen out for those reports of turbulence, and particularly if you've got an area of your flight plan that suggests high shear rates, you want to be thinking about how you're going to manage that and listening out for reports. Personally, what I tend to do is I brief the crew if we are expecting any turbulence, one for their own comfort, but also reminds me of the importance that where we might experience some speed fluctuation. So if I see high shear rates, I put a little range ring around that waypoint to remind us that that's when we need to be extra vigilant. Once airborne, the weather radar is one powerful tool to help the crew make sound weather-related decisions to avoid adverse weather and areas where turbulence might be expected. Altitude and wind gradients are the main contributing factors. On aircraft with no failure and the order thrust engaged or the max climb thrust applied in manual mode, a continuous speed decay during the cruise phase may be due to a large and continuous increase in tailwind or a decrease in the headwind, in addition to an increase in the outside air temperature, where obviously the air gets a little bit thinner, that results in a decrease of the recommended max flight level, or a large or prolonged downdraft when the flight crew flies parallel and downwind in a mountainous area due to orographic waves. Sometimes we can see that as lenticular formations of cloud. The downdraft may be a negative vertical speed of more than 500 feet per minute. Therefore, the aircraft is in a downdraft and the aircraft must climb in order to maintain its altitude, and the pitch angle and the thrust values increase. Without sufficient thrust margin, the flight crew may notice that the aircraft's speed decays, but the recommended max flight level is not modified because the temperature essentially hasn't changed. The flight crew must be aware that at high altitude, the thrust margin, that's the difference between the thrust in use and the maximum available thrust, is limited. The maximum available thrust decreases when there is an increase in altitude and or outside temperature. The recommended max flight level indicated in the FMS decreases when the OAT increases. The nearer the aircraft is to the recommended max, the smaller the thrust margin. So, look at your flight plan very carefully. Look at the recommended maximum, or look at your flight level, and then look at your recommended maximum. Obviously, operationally, we want to try and get as close to the optimum flight level as possible because it's the most economical to operate at that level. But we as crew will modify that if the conditions suggest so. So preventing a speed decay and detecting the phenomenon at any altitude, decreasing the speed too much will certainly lower the aircraft's level of energy and decrease the margins for manoeuvring, thus potentially leading to a loss of control due to stall with an aircraft flying in a degraded yaw. It is important to understand and detect signs of significant speed decay in order to enable a recovery. When the speed decreases, the pilots should be attentive to their speed trend vector as displayed on the PFD and take action if unfavourable speed trend develops in order to remain above green dot. So there's that reference again about the importance of maintaining plus green dot. If the speed decreases further, then the angle of attack must be increased in order to increase the lift coefficient, which keeps the forces balanced. However, it's not possible to infinitely increase the angle of attack. As per the basic aerodynamic rules, the lift coefficient increases linearly with angle of attack up to a point where the airflow separates from the upper surface. If the angle of attack continues to increase, the point of airflow separation is unstable and rapidly fluctuates back and forth. Consequently, the pressure distribution along the wing profile changes constantly and changes the lift position and its magnitude. The effect is called buffeting and is evidenced by vibration. Buffet is a clear sign of an approaching stall, or even the stall itself, depending on its severity, and is created by airflow separation and fluctuations of AOA. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail here because it talks about the low speed side, but I see why the article is focusing on it. I'm talking about overspeed here. But actually, as is noted here, the biggest threat to the safety of flight, both at high and low altitude, relates to speed decay and not necessarily overspeed. I'm talking about the overspeed because I want to remind crews of the importance of keeping the automatics in and for everything that this article suggests. But actually, the more you read into this, Airbus are more concerned actually than of underspeeding the aircraft, as was potentially the case in this mishandled event, and in the numbers that were analysed and presented to Airbus in mishandling of overspeed events. So it's quite critical that we maintain vigilance with this and we apply the correct procedure for obvious reasons. But it seems that overspeed isn't the biggest issue here. It's or to safety, I should say. It's more low speed event. So look, I'm going to close on that now, guys, because I think it's gone on quite long enough. I think we've got some really valuable take homes here of some context on the overspeed warning, the importance of keeping the automatics in, the fact that the autopilot isn't necessarily going to disconnect immediately and provide the high-speed protection. The autopilot is robust in handling overspeed events, so leave it in, apply the correct technique, and of course apply the high-speed prevention techniques and the recovery techniques as per FCTM, and it'll be a largely a non-event for you. Where we have problems is where we disconnect the autopilot and provide excessive loads on the aircraft, and then which may then lead to a low speed condition, getting towards green dots, etc., and the dangers that exist from that. So I think that's it. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've got something from it. I hope it was useful. Stay tuned for lots more to come. I'm getting lots of suggestions from people, and I've got a list. They're on my desk here, as long as your arm, to get through. Apologies if I haven't come back to you and answered some of the questions. I'm probably getting 20 or 30 questions and recommendations a day. It's phenomenal, and I'm just trying to keep on top of it all. So if I haven't come back to you yet, I will do. And stay safe, keep the plate spinning, and I'll speak to you again very soon.